On the windswept edge of the northern fjords, a young Viking girl stands before the gates of an inheritance she never expected. Astrid is barely 12 winters old, orphaned by a brutal raid that took everything she knew. The ranch, sprawled before her, appears abandoned, its fences weathered, its buildings silent against the cold sea air. She believes she has inherited nothing but empty land and fading memories. But deep within the valleys and hidden barns, more than 200 animals survive in secret, waiting for someone brave enough to claim them. What happens when a child who has lost everything discovers a hidden world that needs her just as much as she needs it? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Astrid's world ended began like any other. She woke to the sound of her father's hammer striking iron in the forge below, each blow a rhythm she had known since before she could walk. The smell of wood smoke and salt air drifted through the small window of their home, mixing with the scent of her mother's bread, baking on the hearth. She was the daughter of Bjorn, the shipbuilder, a man whose hands could coax beauty from rough timber and whose reputation brought traders from distant lands. Their village clung to the edge of a deep fjord, houses built into the hillside like birds' nests, connected by narrow paths worn smooth by generations of feet. Astrid knew every stone, every face, every story whispered around winter fires. Her mother Freya taught her the old songs and the careful art of weaving. In the evenings, they would sit together while her father worked, and Freya would tell stories of her own childhood in a place she called the Eastern Valleys, though she never spoke of why she left or who remained there. There was a sadness in her mother's eyes when she spoke of the past, a distance that made young Astrid hold her hand tighter. The raiders came on a moonless night in early autumn. Astrid was 12 winters old enough to understand death, but young enough to believe her family was untouchable. She had been sent to fetch water from the spring when she heard the first screams. The sky behind her glowed orange and red. She dropped the bucket and ran, but her father caught her before she reached their home. "The forge," he said, his voice sharp with fear she had never heard before. "Hide in the cold pit. Do not come out until silence. Do you understand me? Silence." He pushed her toward the workshop, toward the deep pit where they quenched blades in oil and water. She wanted to resist, to find her mother, but his eyes told her this was survival. She climbed down into the narrow space, pulling the wooden cover over herself as the sounds of violence filled the night. She heard everything. Her mother's voice calling her name, her father's roar of defiance, the clash of metal, the crackle of flames consuming wood that had stood for generations. And then, slowly, the terrible quiet that followed destruction. Astrid stayed in that pit for 2 days. When she finally emerged, ash coated everything like grey snow. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Her home was a skeleton of charred beams. She found her father's body near the forge entrance, sword in hand. Her mother she found inside, arms wrapped around the carved drinking horn that had belonged to Astrid's grandfather. Protecting it even in death, the drinking horn was ashwood, polished smooth, etched with the symbols of their family, a ship, a tree, a star. Astrid took it from her mother's cold hands and ran. She ran until her legs gave out, following the high path away from the village. When the sun rose, she looked back and saw only smoke. Survivors trickled into the forest throughout that day. Old Gunhild, the village elder, found Astrid curled beneath an oak tree, clutching the horn like a lifeline. They lived as refugees for 3 months, scattered among neighboring settlements, surviving on charity and the labor they could offer. Gunhild took Astrid into her care, a silent child who spoke only when necessary and never smiled. The old woman was patient, asking nothing, providing warmth and food and quiet company. Then one evening, Gunhild sat Astrid down with unusual formality. "Your mother had family," she said. "A brother far to the north. He died last winter, and his property passes to his nearest blood." "I have no family," Astrid whispered. "You have an inheritance, land, a ranch at the edge of the northern fjords. Your mother never spoke of it, but the law is clear. It belongs to you now. The journey took a week, traveling by borrowed cart and hired ferry. They moved through landscapes that grew progressively wilder and more beautiful. Mountains rose like the backs of sleeping giants. The fjords cut deep into the land, water so clear you could see fish swimming 20 feet down. Eagles circled overhead, and the wind carried scents of pine and stone. Gunhild spoke little during the journey, but her silence felt heavy with unspoken knowledge. When Astrid asked about her uncle, the old woman would only say, "He was a keeper of things others abandoned." He had a gift for understanding what was lost. They arrived at sunset on the 7th day. The ranch sprawled before them, vast and seemingly empty. Wooden fences stretched across hills and valleys. Buildings dotted the landscape, weathered but standing. Everything was silent. Gunhild handed Astrid a rusted iron key. "This opens the main gate. What waits beyond is yours to claim or refuse. But know this, child, some inheritances come with duties that cannot be shirked." That night they camped outside the gates. Astrid lay awake, watching stars wheel overhead, listening to the distant cry of nightbirds. She clutched her father's drinking horn and her mother's memory, standing at the threshold between grief and an unknown future. The key was heavy in her pocket, and somewhere beyond those gates, a life she could not imagine waited to begin. Dawn broke cold and pale over the fjord. Astrid woke with frost on her blanket and determination in her chest. Gunhild was already awake, packing the few supplies they had carried. "Today you decide," the old woman said. "Walk through that gate or turn back." Astrid looked at the rusted iron barrier that separated her from whatever lay beyond. The key felt warm in her hand, heated by her grip. She walked to the gate without answering, inserted the key, and turned. The lock resisted, then gave with a grinding protest. The gate swung open, on protesting hinges. The path beyond was overgrown with wild grass, but it was still visible, winding between weathered fences toward a cluster of buildings in the distance. Astrid stepped through. Gunhild followed, silent as a shadow. They walked for nearly an hour, following the path as it curved through rolling hills. Something felt wrong, though Astrid could not name it at first. Then she realized what bothered her. The grass near the path was shorter than it should be, grazed down in patches. Fresh tracks crossed the dirt, hoof prints and the drag marks of something heavy being pulled. "Someone has been here," Astrid said. Gunhild nodded but said nothing. The main house appeared ahead, a solid structure of timber and stone, built to withstand northern winters. The roof was intact, the door closed. Smoke stains darkened the walls near the chimney, evidence of fires long burned. Astrid approached slowly, expecting emptiness. The door was unlocked. It opened onto a large room that served as both living space and workspace. A table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars, tools, and books. Dust covered everything, but not as thickly as it should after months of abandonment. On the table, positioned as if waiting for someone to read it, lay a leather-bound book. Astrid approached it carefully, half expecting it to vanish like morning mist. The leather was water-stained and cracked, but the book was real and solid under her fingers. She opened it. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, columns of names and numbers, dates and notes. At the top of the first page, written in larger script, Ranch Ledger. Property of Eirik Freyson. Year of our settlement, 847. Astrid's breath caught. Freyson. Son of Freya. Her mother's family name, the one she never spoke. She began reading. The entries detailed animals, goats, sheep, cattle, horses. Each had a name, a description, a date of arrival, notes about temperament and health. The numbers grew as she turned pages. 10 goats became 20. 15 sheep became 40. 5 horses became 12. The latest entries were dated from the previous winter, written in a shakier hand. Snowfoot, the old mare, passed in her sleep. She lived well here. Total horses, 11. Total cattle, 32. Total sheep, 67. Total goats, 43. Pigs, 18. Chickens and geese. Too many to count accurately, perhaps 50. All thriving. All safe. Astrid's hands trembled as she added the numbers. Over 200 animals recorded as living on this ranch less than a year ago. She looked around the empty house, then out the window at the silent landscape. "Where are they?" she whispered. Gunhild moved to stand beside her, looking over her shoulder at the ledger. The old woman's face showed no surprise, only a deep sadness. "You knew," Astrid said, accusation sharpening her voice. "You knew about this. I knew your uncle kept animals. I did not know how many, or what became of them after his death. They cannot all be dead. Someone would have found bodies. The land would show signs. Perhaps they were sold. Perhaps they wandered away." But even as Gunhild spoke, a sound drifted through the open door. Distant but distinct, the bleat of a goat. Then another sound, deeper, the low of cattle. Astrid rushed to the door and stared out at the hills and valleys, stretching in every direction. Nothing moved in sight. The landscape appeared empty, peaceful, innocent. Yet the sounds came again, from different directions now, as if the land itself were alive and watching. "They are still here," Astrid breathed. "Hiding!" Gunhild's expression confirmed what Astrid had guessed. "Your uncle had a gift. Animals trusted him, followed him, obeyed him. When he died, they remained. But without a master, they have become wild again. Then I will find them. Child, you barely know how to care for yourself. 200 animals require knowledge, strength, constant work. You are 12 years old and alone." Astrid turned to face the old woman, clutching the ledger to her chest. "I am the daughter of Bjorn and Freya. I survived when my world burned. I can survive this. Surviving is not the same as succeeding. I must return to the village tomorrow. The others depend on me. You will be truly alone here. Then I will be alone." They stared at each other, old wisdom facing young determination. Finally, Gunhild nodded slowly. "Your mother had that same fire. It brought her both joy and sorrow." That night, Astrid explored the house more thoroughly, finding her uncle's bedroom, a storeroom with dwindling supplies, and a loft filled with tools for animal husbandry. She lay in a bed that still smelled faintly of the man who had slept there, reading his ledger by candlelight, learning the names of creatures she had never seen. Outside, the sounds continued. Movement in the darkness. Life hiding just beyond reach, waiting to see what she would do. Gunhild left at first light, her departure marked only by a hand on Astrid's shoulder and words spoken low. "Trust your instincts. Watch more than you act. Animals know a kind heart from a desperate one." Then she was gone, and Astrid stood truly alone for the first time in her life. The silence pressed against her ears until she heard past it. Wind through grass, water trickling somewhere distant, the cry of gulls over the fjord. And beneath it all, the subtle sounds of hidden life. She began with the barn, a massive structure 50 paces from the main house. The doors stood slightly ajar, hanging crooked on iron hinges. She pulled them wider, letting morning light spill into the shadowed interior. The space was vast and empty. Stalls lined both walls, enough to house 30 animals at least. Hay lay scattered across the floor, old and dried but not completely decayed. She walked deeper inside, her footsteps echoing. Against the far wall, leaning as if placed there deliberately, stood a carved wooden staff. Astrid lifted it carefully. The wood was smooth from years of handling, worn to a perfect grip. The top was carved into the shape of a ram's head, details so fine she could see individual curls in the horns. This had been held by someone who spent more time with it than without it. Her uncle's shepherd's staff. She carried it outside, feeling its weight and balance. Holding it made her feel less alone, as if some fragment of the man who had created this place walked beside her. The evidence was everywhere once she learned to see it. Droppings near the fence lines, still fresh enough to crumble rather than turn to dust. Wool caught on a splintered board, white and grey mixed together. Hoof prints in the soft earth near the water trough, dozens of them, overlapping in patterns that spoke of frequent visits. They came at night. They used the facilities her uncle had built. Then they vanished before dawn, retreating to hiding places she had not yet discovered. She spent the morning exploring, mapping the ranch in her mind. To the north, the land rose into rocky hills dotted with caves. To the east, thick forest pressed close, offering shelter and concealment. South stretched open grazing land, deceptively empty. West, the fjord provided a natural barrier, with steep cliffs dropping to dark water. Her stomach reminded her of practical needs. The storeroom held dried fish, grain, some root vegetables beginning to soften. Enough for perhaps 2 weeks if she was careful. After that, she would need to fish, forage, or find help. She made a small fire in the hearth and cooked a simple meal, her mind working through problems. The animals were feral now, trusting no one. Approaching them directly would fail. She needed to let them come to her, to prove she meant no harm. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, words spoken while teaching her to work metal. Patience is not waiting. Patience is understanding that some things cannot be rushed. The iron tells you when it is ready to be shaped. After eating, she took a portion of grain and walked to the edge of the northern hills. She found a flat stone and poured the grain onto it, then retreated 20 paces and sat with her back against a boulder. She waited. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher. Her legs cramped from sitting still. Then at the edge of her vision, movement. A goat emerged from between 2 rocks, small and brown with white patches. It froze when it saw her, ears forward, every muscle tense for flight. Astrid did not move. She barely breathed. The goat watched her with yellow eyes that held intelligence and deep wariness. Minutes stretched. Finally, the goat took 1 step toward the grain, then another. It reached the stone and began eating, but its attention never left her. More goats appeared, emboldened by the first. Soon, 6 of them crowded around the stone, competing for the grain. Astrid watched, memorizing their markings, trying to match them to descriptions in the ledger. When the grain was gone, they scattered like smoke, vanishing back into the hills. But one paused at the boundary between rock and grass. It looked back at her, and in that moment Astrid felt something shift. Recognition, perhaps, or the first thread of possible trust. She returned to the house as afternoon shadows lengthened. Near the barn, she discovered fresh tracks she had not seen that morning. Lodger prints, deeply impressed. Horses had come while she explored the hills. That night, she lay in bed studying the ledger by candlelight. Her uncle had written notes beside many names. Bergthora, grey ewe, gentle but stubborn. Found her abandoned after a harsh winter. She remembers kindness. Astrid traced the words with her finger. Bergthora. Tomorrow she would leave grain near the barn and see who came. She would learn their patterns, their preferences, their fears. She would prove herself worthy of the inheritance not through force, but through understanding. Outside, something large moved past the house. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate. Astrid went to the window and caught a glimpse of shadow darker than night. A horse, massive and powerful, patrolling the perimeter like a guardian. The animals were not just hiding. They were watching her too, measuring her worth, deciding if she deserved to stay. 2 weeks passed in patterns of small victories and quiet failures. Astrid learned the rhythms of her hidden inheritance, the way animals moved with the sun and retreated with the moon. She left grain at 5 locations each morning, and by evening it was always gone. The goats grew bold enough to eat while she watched from a distance. The sheep remained more cautious, appearing only as white shapes on distant hillsides. On the 14th day, she climbed into the attic of the main house, searching for additional supplies. Dust lay thick on everything, and cobwebs draped the rafters like decorative nets. Broken furniture filled one corner, and old tools lined the walls. She was about to descend when sunlight caught something metal in the far corner. She pulled aside a rotted canvas to reveal a brass bell, larger than her head, suspended from a wooden frame. The metal was tarnished green in places, but intricate runes had been carved around its rim. She traced them with her finger, recognizing some from her mother's teachings. Symbols meaning gather, home, safety, return. The bell was heavy, but she managed to lower it through the attic opening and carry it outside. She hung it from a post near the barn, at a height where she could reach the rope. When she pulled, the sound rolled across the landscape like thunder, deep and resonant, carrying into every valley and cave. Nothing happened. The hills remained empty, the forest silent. She felt foolish, like a child playing at being something she was not, but that evening, when she went to check her feeding stations, she found something new. At the northern station, a grey sheep stood waiting. It did not flee when Astrid approached, though it kept 10 paces between them. The sheep had a tear in its wool on the left flank, and when it turned, Astrid saw brambles tangled in the wound. "Bergthora," she whispered, remembering the description from the ledger. The sheep's ears flicked toward her voice. It took 1 step closer, then stopped, trembling. Astrid set down the grain she carried and backed away. The sheep ate but kept watching her, intelligence clear in its dark eyes. The next morning, Bergthora was waiting near the barn when Astrid emerged. The brambles were worse, infected now, and the sheep moved with a limp. Astrid spent an hour approaching slowly, speaking in low tones, offering grain from her hand. Finally, trembling with either fear or pain, Bergthora allowed her to touch the wounded flank. The work was delicate and slow. Astrid used her small knife to cut away the brambles, her hands gentle despite the sheep's occasional flinch. She cleaned the wound with water from the well, remembering how her mother had tended injuries in their village. The sheep stood still through it all, as if understanding that this pain led to relief. When it was done, Bergthora did not flee. She stayed near the barn all day, grazing close enough that Astrid could hear her breathing. That evening, 3 more sheep appeared on the hillside, watching. By the next morning, they had moved closer to the barn. Astrid rang the brass bell again at dawn. The sound carried across the ranch, and this time she saw movement in response. Not coming toward her, not yet, but a stirring in the hidden places, an acknowledgement that the sound meant something. She mapped the property more thoroughly, discovering natural springs where animals drank, sheltered valleys where they grazed, and caves that showed signs of regular use. Her uncle had understood this land deeply, had worked with its natural features rather than against them. Every fence line guided animals towards safety. Every shelter faced away from harsh winds. The ledger became her constant companion. She read it each night, learning about individual animals, their histories, their quirks. Many had been saved from slaughter or abandonment. A horse named Stormwind had been found starving after her owner died. A bull called Ironhorn had been deemed too aggressive for normal herds, but thrived here in open space. Each animal had a story of survival, of being given a second chance. In the 3rd week, disaster struck. Astrid found the body near the eastern fence line. A lamb, torn apart by something with powerful jaws and sharp teeth. Wolf tracks surrounded the kill site, 4 distinct sets moving in coordinated patterns. A pack, she stood over the small body, grief and anger warring in her chest. This lamb had a name in the ledger, Solfrid, born the previous spring, described as curious and gentle. Now she was gone, killed for meat by creatures that saw this ranch as hunting grounds. That night Astrid did not sleep in the house. She carried blankets to the barn and made a bed in an empty stall. If wolves were hunting her animals, she would be closer, ready to respond. It was foolish, perhaps, a child thinking she could protect hundreds of animals from predators that had survived in these mountains for generations. But Bergthora came into the barn at dusk, settling in the stall beside Astrid's. The 3 other sheep followed, claiming their own spaces. They did not flee from her presence. They chose to shelter near her, as if recognizing that together they were stronger than apart. She woke before dawn to find 12 sheep inside the barn, standing in a loose circle around her stall, their bodies forming a living wall. Outside, wolf howls echoed across the hills, closer than they should be, testing boundaries, looking for weakness. Astrid gripped her shepherd's staff and stood. The sheep shifted but did not panic. Through the barn door, she saw shapes moving in the pre-dawn darkness. Not wolves, larger forms, deliberately positioned between the barn and the forest edge. The horses had come down from their hidden pastures and formed their own defensive line. The inheritance was choosing to trust her. Now she had to prove worthy of that trust. 1 month into her inheritance, Astrid had established an uneasy routine. 30 animals now responded to the brass bell, gathering near the barn for feeding and shelter. The rest remained hidden, watchful, waiting. The wolves circled the property at night, their presence a constant weight on her mind. She was repairing the ledger's damaged binding when her fingers found something wrong. The back cover felt thicker than the front, the leather bulging slightly along the spine. She worked carefully, using her knife to separate the outer leather from the wooden board beneath. A sealed letter slipped out, folded and pressed flat by years of weight. The wax seal bore the imprint of a tree, the same symbol carved on her father's drinking horn. Her hand shook as she broke the seal and unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was precise, despite obvious age and illness in the hand that wrote it. To whoever inherits this burden, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the question before you is whether to continue what I began or surrender it to forces that will destroy it. I pray you choose wisely. Astrid read on, her breath growing shallow. Her uncle Eric revealed himself slowly through the words. He had been her mother's brother, estranged from the family for reasons he did not fully explain. Their father had been a hard man, believing in strength and conquest above all else. Eric had been the quiet one, the one who noticed suffering and could not ignore it. I left our father's hall 30 years ago after he ordered 36 horses killed because they could not be broken for war. I took 5 of those horses with me, stolen in the night, and I ran. Your mother, my sister Freya, helped me escape. She paid a price for that kindness, though she never told me what. We lost contact for many years. The letter described how Eric had found this land, far from clan politics and the endless hunger for conquest. He built the ranch with his own hands, intending it as a simple farm. But animals found him, or he found them. Horses destined for sacrifice in religious ceremonies. Cattle about to be slaughtered when their owners died. Sheep abandoned after raids left their shepherds dead. Goats deemed too old or too difficult to be worth keeping. I could not turn them away. Each one that came, I saw the same fear in their eyes that I had felt fleeing my father's judgment. This ranch became a sanctuary, though I never intended it as such. It became a place where the unwanted could survive. The words grew heavier. Eric explained that he kept the ranch's true nature secret because the local Jarl would have claimed the animals as unclaimed property. The law was clear. Animals without registered owners belonged to whoever discovered them. Eric had carefully maintained records showing himself as the legal owner, acquiring each animal through legitimate means, even when the truth was more complicated. Your mother visited me once, 12 years ago. She had married a shipbuilder and had a daughter named Astrid. She told me that if anything happened to her, I should watch for that girl. She said her daughter had a kind heart, but would need purpose to survive grief. She made me promise that Astrid would inherit this place if I died. I kept that promise. Tears blurred Astrid's vision. Her mother had known. She had planned for this possibility, had seen far enough ahead to prepare a path through tragedy. The weight of that foresight pressed against Astrid's chest. The letter continued, with practical warnings. The ranch existed in legal uncertainty. Eric's ownership was documented, but his death created vulnerability. If authorities discovered the number of animals here, questions would be asked about how he acquired them all. Some had been taken from situations where powerful men would be embarrassed by their cruelty being exposed. The animals are not just livestock. They are refugees, like you and I were refugees from different kinds of violence. They have adapted to freedom and secrecy. They hide because they have learned that visibility means danger. If you choose to keep this sanctuary, you must protect not just their lives, but their invisibility. The final paragraph struck deepest. I see now that this burden is too great for one person, but perhaps it is the right burden for someone who understands loss and survival. The animals do not need a master. They need a guardian, someone who will stand between them and the world that would use them up without thought. If you are that person, ring the bell each dawn and dusk. Call them home. Make them trust that home exists. Astrid set the letter down with trembling hands. She walked to the window and looked out at the hills where hundreds of animals still hid. She understood now why her mother had left her family, why she never spoke of the past, why sadness haunted her eyes. Freya had chosen kindness over family loyalty, had paid an unnamed price for helping her brother escape, and now that choice, that legacy of defying cruelty, had passed to Astrid. She thought of the boat she had seen 3 times now, passing along the fjord, men on board studying the coastline. She thought of the wolves testing the boundaries. She thought of winter coming, of supplies running low, of being 12 years old and responsible for lives she had not asked to protect. The choice was not whether to keep the animals. That decision had been made the moment she unlocked the gate. The choice was whether to protect them as her uncle had, in secret and shadow, or to seek help and risk exposure. To trust in her own strength, or to trust in the mercy of others. She returned to the ledger and read the names again. Bergthora, Stormwind, Ironhorn, Solfrid, who had died to wolves. Each name was a life her uncle had deemed worth saving. Each one now depended on her choice. Astrid lifted her father's drinking horn and her mother's memory. She understood now why this inheritance had come to her. Not because she was strong enough, but because she knew what it meant to be the one who needed sanctuary. The letter changed everything and nothing. Astrid still woke before dawn, still rang the brass bell, still scattered grain at her feeding stations. But now she moved with purpose sharpened by understanding. The animals were not simply her responsibility. They were a legacy of resistance against casual cruelty, and protecting them meant more than keeping them fed. She found the map 2 days after reading the letter, rolled inside a hollow post in the barn. Her uncle's hand had drawn every detail of the ranch with the precision of a military strategist. Each valley, cave, and shelter was marked. But more than that, he had noted escape routes, defensive positions, places where animals could be hidden if threats appeared. The ranch was not just a sanctuary. It was a fortress designed to look harmless. Astrid spread the map on the kitchen table and studied it by candlelight. Her uncle had marked natural choke points where a few defenders could hold against many. He had identified caves deep enough to hide entire herds. He had drawn sight lines showing where watchers could see approaching danger from any direction. She began implementing what the map revealed. Each morning, she walked new sections of the property, understanding how her uncle had thought, how he had turned landscape into strategy. A seemingly random pile of rocks near the eastern ridge was actually a cairn marking the entrance to a cave system large enough for 50 sheep. A fallen tree near the northern boundary had been deliberately positioned to create a barrier that funneled movement toward defensible ground. The animals themselves showed coordinated behavior she had not fully recognized before. The goats grazed in rotating patterns, always leaving some on high ground as sentries. The horses moved between 3 different pastures on a schedule that ensured they were never all in one place. Even the cattle, seemingly slow and placid, positioned themselves with the strongest bulls at the edges of the herd. Her uncle had not just saved these animals, he had taught them to survive. On the morning of her 40th day at the ranch, Astrid woke to find a horse standing outside the barn. Not one of the smaller mares she had glimpsed at a distance, but a massive creature, black as midnight, with a white star on her forehead. The horse watched Astrid with eyes that held intelligence and judgment. Astrid checked the ledger, though she already knew. Stormwind, 15 hands high. Rescued 8 years ago from a lord who starved his horses when they could no longer race. Described as fiercely protective, a natural leader, slow to trust but loyal beyond measure once trust was earned. She approached slowly, carrying no food, making no sudden movements. Stormwind did not flee. When Astrid was 10 paces away, the horse nickered softly, a sound that seemed to echo across the property. Within minutes, other horses appeared from the hills. 6 of them, then 9, then all 11 that the ledger recorded. They formed a loose circle around Stormwind and Astrid, and in that moment Astrid understood. This was not just acceptance. This was recruitment. The horses had been watching her for weeks, measuring her capability, and now they were showing her what they protected. Stormwind turned and walked toward the western cliffs. Astrid followed, The other horses fell in behind, a processional of power and grace. They led her to a sheltered valley she had not yet explored, hidden behind a rock formation that blocked it from casual view. The valley was alive with animals. Cattle grazed in the rich grass. Goats climbed the rocky sides. Sheep dotted the slopes like snow. Chickens and geese wandered near a small pond. This was where the majority had been hiding, in a place so perfectly concealed that even someone walking the property might miss it. Astrid stood at the valley's entrance and felt the weight of what she was seeing. 200 lives, perhaps more, existing in secret coordination. They had survived her uncle's death by retreating to this stronghold, waiting to see if the next human would be worthy of knowing it existed. Stormwind walked to Astrid's side and lowered her great head, breathing warm air against the girl's face. It was permission and partnership, offered by a creature that had every reason to distrust humans forever. The wolf threat intensified as autumn deepened. Astrid found tracks closer to the buildings each morning. The pack was growing bolder, testing boundaries, looking for weakness. She set up a system of bells at key points around the property, using the map to position them where sound would carry warning to every valley. She also discovered her uncle's hidden supply caches, grain stored in sealed barrels buried beneath false floors, dried fish wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden in roof spaces, salt, oil, rope, tools, medicines for both animals and humans. He had prepared for siege, for isolation, for the possibility that help might never come. Winter was approaching. The boat had passed again, and this time the men aboard had stopped to study the property through distance viewing devices. They had not landed, but their interest was clear. Whatever they suspected or sought, the ranch had attracted attention. Astrid spent her evenings treating injuries, learning which animals needed special care, memorizing personalities and histories. A bull named Ironhorn had a habit of checking the perimeter at midnight, self-appointed guardian. A ewe called Greyfoot led the other sheep with calm authority, deciding when to move and when to shelter. A pig named Rooter had learned to alert others by squealing when strangers approached. They were not a collection of random animals. They were a community, organized and functional, held together by mutual need and the memory of a man who had valued their lives. Now they watched Astrid with the same question she saw in Stormwind's eyes. Would she be able to do what her uncle had done? Could a child of 12 winters stand between them and the dangers that circled ever closer? She did not know the answer, but each dawn she rang the brass bell, and each evening she walked the property with her shepherd's staff, and slowly, day by day, the hidden animals emerged to test whether home was possible again. The first snow came early, driven by winds that howled down from the mountains like hungry ghosts. Astrid woke in the barn to darkness, so complete she could not see her hands. The temperature had dropped sharply and her breath formed clouds in the air. Around her, animals stirred restlessly, sensing something wrong in the night. Then she heard it. A howl closer than any had been before, not from the forest edge, but from inside the property near the northern hills. The wolves had crossed the boundary. Astrid grabbed her shepherd's staff and ran outside. The snow fell thick and fast, reducing visibility to a few paces. More howls answered the first, surrounding the barn from 3 directions. The pack had split up, coordinating their approach like seasoned hunters. She had one chance to warn everyone. Astrid ran to the post where the war horn hung, the ancient instrument her uncle had kept for emergencies. She had found it weeks ago, but never dared use it, fearing the sound would attract unwanted attention from the men on the boats. Now silence meant death. She lifted the horn to her lips and blew with all the breath in her lungs. The sound that emerged was primal and vast, a call that seemed to shake the earth itself. It rolled across the ranch, into every valley and cave, reaching places her voice never could. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world erupted into motion. Animals poured from hiding places in every direction. The goats came first, nimble and fast, racing toward the barn from the northern hills. Behind them, sheep moved in tight groups, the ewes protecting lambs at the center. Cattle emerged from the eastern valley, bulls leading with horns lowered. And from the west came the horses, Stormwind at their head, moving like a cavalry charge. The wolves struck as the animals converged. 6 of them, grey and massive, exploding from the snow-covered darkness. They went for the sheep, the easiest targets, trying to separate the weak from the strong. But the animals did not scatter in panic. The cattle formed a defensive circle, the largest bulls facing outward, creating a living fortress around the smaller creatures. The goats retreated to high ground, using rocks and elevation as protection. And the horses charged directly at the wolves with a fury that took Astrid's breath away. Stormwind led the assault, her hooves striking like hammers. A wolf lunged at her throat and she pivoted with shocking speed, catching it with a kick that sent it tumbling through the snow. 2 more horses joined her, forming a wedge that drove the wolves back from the sheep. Astrid found herself running toward the fight, without thinking, her staff raised like a weapon. A wolf separated from the pack, circling toward the barn where the chickens had taken shelter. She put herself between the predator and its prey, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The wolf was enormous, its eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the storm. It lowered its head and snarled, showing teeth designed to tear flesh from bone. Astrid had never felt such raw terror. She was a child with a stick facing a creature built for killing. Stormwind appeared beside her, like thunder-made flesh. The horse placed herself between Astrid and the wolf, her size and presence enough to make the predator hesitate. Behind them, Ironhorn the bull moved into position, completing a barrier of muscle and horn and absolute determination. They were protecting her. Just as she had tried to protect them, they had chosen to stand with her against the darkness. The battle raged for minutes that felt like hours. Wolves darted in and retreated, testing for weaknesses, finding none. The animals moved with practiced coordination, as if they had trained for this moment. The sheep stayed tight in their defensive circle. The cattle held their positions. The horses harried any wolf that came too close, giving no opportunity for a killing strike. Astrid fought alongside them, using her staff to strike at any wolf that approached the barn. She was no warrior, but fear and love gave her strength she did not know she possessed. These animals had become hers, and she had become theirs, and together they were more than the sum of their separate parts. A wolf broke through toward the sheep, jaws snapping at a young lamb. Greyfoot, the lead ewe, lowered her head and met the charge with her own, horns catching the wolf's shoulder and sending it sprawling. Other sheep pressed, in stamping with sharp hooves, driving the predator back through sheer numbers and shared fury. The wolves began to retreat. They had expected easy prey and found instead organized resistance. One by one they melted back into the storm, their howls fading as they withdrew beyond the property line. Silence fell gradually, broken only by heavy breathing and the whisper of falling snow. Animals stood in defensive positions, watching the darkness, ready for the wolves to return. But minutes passed, and nothing came. Astrid walked among them, checking for injuries, speaking soft words of gratitude and relief. 2 sheep had deep gashes that would need treatment. 1 horse had a torn ear. But they had survived, all of them, because they had fought together. She found Stormwind standing near the barn, snow gathering on her dark coat. Astrid pressed her face against the horse's neck and felt the animal's breath, steady and strong. No words were needed. They had passed through fire together and emerged changed. As dawn broke pale and cold, the animals did not retreat to their hiding places. They remained gathered near the barn and house, filling the visible space with their presence. The hidden ranch was hidden no longer. They had chosen to stand in the open, united, no longer willing to survive in shadow. Astrid rang the brass bell, and every animal still enough to hear responded, moving closer still. The sanctuary had become something more than a collection of refugees. It had become a family, bound by battle and mutual protection, ready to face whatever came next together. 3 days after the battle, the boat returned. This time it did not pass by. It landed on the shore below the cliffs, and 6 men climbed the steep path toward the ranch. Astrid watched them approach from the barn door, her hand resting on Stormwind's shoulder. Around her, animals gathered in visible numbers, no longer hiding, their presence undeniable. The men were armed but not aggressive, their weapons sheathed, their movements cautious. The leader was a man of perhaps 50 winters, his beard grey and his eyes sharp with intelligence. He stopped 20 paces from the barn and raised his hand in greeting. "I am Hallstein, representative of Jarl Eriksson," he called. "We have been watching this property for weeks, concerned about unusual activity. We mean no harm, but the Jarl requires answers about what transpires here." Astrid stepped forward, her legs steady despite the fear running through her veins. She had her uncle's property deed folded in her pocket, carried every day since finding the letter. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "I am Astrid, daughter of Bjorn the shipbuilder and Freya Eriksdottir. This ranch is my inheritance, passed to me through my uncle Eirik Freyson. The animals you see are mine by law and right." Hallstein's eyes widened slightly at her mother's family name. He exchanged glances with his companions, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or respect for a lineage he knew. "Eirik Freyson," he said slowly. "The Keeper. We wondered what became of his sanctuary when word of his death reached us. You are truly his heir?" Astrid produced the deed, unfolding it with steady hands. Hallstein approached and examined it carefully, reading the seals and signatures. When he looked up, his expression had softened. "Your uncle served Jarl Eriksson with honor in his youth, before he chose a different path. The Jarl gave him this land as payment for services rendered, with full rights of ownership and no obligations. This deed is legitimate and binding." He paused, looking around at the gathered animals. "But, child, do you understand the responsibility you have claimed? There must be 200 animals here." 217, Astrid said. "Each one recorded in my uncle's ledger, each one here by purpose, not accident." One of the other men spoke up. "The Jarl could claim them as unclaimed property. No child can manage such a herd alone. They are not unclaimed," Hallstein said firmly. "The deed and ledger establish clear ownership. And as for whether she can manage them," he gestured at the scene around them, at animals standing calm and organized, at a ranch that clearly functioned despite its young keeper. "The evidence suggests she already does," he turned back to Astrid. "The Jarl sent us to investigate, not to seize. He remembers your uncle with respect and will honor the inheritance. But he offers assistance, supplies when needed, occasional help with heavy labor, recognition of your stewardship in the eyes of law. This ranch will be recorded as a legitimate holding under your name, protected from any who might challenge your claim." Relief flooded through Astrid, so intense it made her knees weak. She had not realized how much fear she carried until it began to lift. "I accept the Jarl's offer with gratitude. I will maintain this sanctuary as my uncle did, giving refuge to those who need it." Hallstein smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Your mother would be proud. She was known for her courage, even when it cost her." He did not elaborate, and Astrid did not ask, but understanding passed between them. The men departed, leaving behind 2 sacks of grain and promises of more support when winter deepened. Astrid watched their boat disappear into the fjord's morning mist, then turned to face her inheritance fully revealed in daylight. Winter passed in rhythms of care and growth. The injured sheep healed. Lambs were born in the protected valleys, their bleating a promise of continuity. The horses grew sleek and strong on the grain supplements. Even the wolves, having learned the cost of attacking organized resistance, kept their distance. Astrid grew too, in ways that had nothing to do with height or age. She learned to read weather in the clouds and animal behavior in subtle signs. She could tell when a sheep was ill before symptoms showed, when a horse needed extra care, when the cattle sensed approaching storms. The ledger expanded with her own notes, observations written in handwriting that grew steadier with each entry. Spring arrived with melting snow and returning birds. On the morning when the sun finally held real warmth, Astrid stood on the hill above the ranch, holding her father's drinking horn and looking out at the land she had defended. Animals grazed in every visible valley. Foals ran with their mothers, testing new legs and discovering joy. Life had not just survived here, it had flourished. She rang the brass bell, and the response was immediate. 217 animals, plus the new births, acknowledged the call. They did not gather close, no longer needing constant proximity for security, but each one lifted its head in her direction. Recognition, trust, family. Astrid thought of her parents. Their lives cut short by violence they did not deserve. She thought of her uncle, laboring alone for decades to create this sanctuary. She thought of her mother's hidden sacrifice, the price she paid for choosing kindness over family expectation. All of it had led to this moment, to a young girl standing on a hill with a legacy of protected lives depending on her courage. Some inheritances were measured in gold or land or power. This one was measured in heartbeats and breathing, and the stubborn determination of creatures who refused to surrender to a world that saw them as expendable. It was the heaviest burden Astrid could imagine. It was also the greatest gift. She descended the hill toward the barn, where morning tasks waited and animals needed tending. The sanctuary would continue, protected now by law and by the fierce love of a keeper who understood what it meant to need refuge. The hidden ranch had found its guardian, and the guardian had found her home. Summer brought warmth that transformed the ranch into a paradise of green grass and wildflowers. Astrid had survived her first winter as keeper, and the experience had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She no longer hesitated when making decisions about the animals' care. Her hands had grown calloused from work, her arms stronger from lifting feed sacks and repairing fences. The supplies from Jarl Eriksson arrived monthly now, delivered by Holstein himself, who had taken a personal interest in the young keeper's success. He brought not just grain and salt, but also knowledge, teaching Astrid things her uncle's notes had not covered. How to recognize early signs of hoof rot, which herbs grew wild on the property and could treat common ailments. How to predict weather patterns by watching the behavior of birds and the color of the evening sky. On a morning when the sun burned hot and bright, Astrid discovered something new in the eastern section of the property. She had been tracking a small group of goats that had developed a habit of disappearing for hours at a time, always returning well-fed and content. Following their trail led her to a narrow gap between two rock faces, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Beyond the gap, the land opened into a hidden meadow she had never known existed. The grass grew thick and lush, fed by an underground spring that bubbled up in the center. Apple trees, old and gnarled, lined one edge of the meadow, their branches heavy with developing fruit. The goats grazed peacefully, looking up at her approach, with expressions that seemed almost smug. Astrid laughed, the sound surprising her. She laughed so rarely now that the sensation felt foreign, like rediscovering a skill she had forgotten she possessed. The goats had found their own secret paradise within the sanctuary, a place even her uncle might not have known about. She spent the afternoon exploring the meadow, cataloguing what grew there and imagining its possibilities. The apple trees alone represented wealth. Come autumn, she could harvest fruit for the animals and herself, perhaps even trade surplus to nearby settlements. The spring meant water even in drought. This hidden place could serve as emergency shelter if threats ever forced evacuation of the main ranch. That evening, as she recorded her discovery in the ledger, Astrid found herself thinking about the future in ways she had not dared before. For months, survival had been her only goal. Keep the animals fed, protect them from wolves, maintain the secret until she could secure legal protection. But now, with summer's abundance around her and the sanctuary legally recognized, she could think beyond mere survival. What would this place become in 5 years? 10. Would she still be here, a young woman instead of a girl, managing a thriving operation? Would other orphans or outcasts find their way here, seeking the same refuge the animals had found? Her uncle had worked alone, but perhaps the sanctuary could grow into something larger, a community of both human and animal refugees. The thought both excited and frightened her. She was barely managing as things stood. The idea of taking on more responsibility seemed impossible, yet her uncle had started with 5 stolen horses and built this. Who was to say what she might accomplish given time? Stormwind found her that evening, as the horse often did when Astrid sat alone with her thoughts. The mare had become her constant companion, a presence that offered both protection and comfort. Astrid leaned against the horse's shoulder and watched the sun set over the fjord, painting the water gold and crimson. "I miss them," she said softly, speaking to Stormwind as she often did. "Mother and father. Uncle Eric, even though I never knew him. I miss having someone to ask when I do not know what to do next." Stormwind's only answer was a gentle nicker and the warmth of her presence. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the weight of responsibility pressed so heavy that Astrid wanted nothing more than to be a child again, protected rather than protector. But those moments passed, and she rose each time to face another day of duties that could not be postponed. A letter arrived with the next supply delivery. Halstein handed it to her with an expression she could not quite read. The seal bore the Jarl's mark, official and imposing. Astrid's hands shook slightly as she broke the wax and unfolded the parchment. The Jarl himself had written, his script formal but not unkind. He acknowledged her successful stewardship and expressed admiration for her dedication. Then he made an offer that took her breath away. Each autumn, he hosted a gathering of landholders and notable figures from throughout the region. He invited her to attend, to be recognized formally as a legitimate landholder despite her age, to meet others who might offer knowledge or alliance. Astrid read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what acceptance would mean. Leaving the ranch, even for a few days, felt impossible. Who would care for the animals? What if wolves returned? What if something went wrong in her absence? But the opportunity was equally impossible to dismiss. Recognition at the Jarl's gathering would solidify her position beyond any future challenge. She would meet people who understood animal husbandry at levels she had not yet reached. She might find allies, resources, knowledge that could help the sanctuary thrive rather than merely survive. That night she lay awake, torn between fear of leaving and fear of refusing. The animals had taught her much about courage, but they could not teach her this. Some decisions had to be made alone, in the quiet darkness, weighing risks against possibilities and hoping wisdom would emerge from uncertainty. By morning, she had decided, she would accept the Jarl's invitation. The sanctuary had survived her uncle's death and her own inexperience. It would survive her brief absence, and if it brought knowledge or connections that strengthened the refuge, then the risk was worth taking. She wrote her acceptance carefully. Her handwriting still less elegant than she wished, but clear enough to convey respect and gratitude. Halstein would carry it back on his next visit. The gathering was 2 months away, in the early days of autumn, when harvests were complete and travel was still easy. 2 months to prepare the ranch for her absence. 2 months to grow brave enough to leave it. 2 months to transform from a girl who had inherited a burden into a landholder who walked among equals, carrying the weight of 200 lives with the dignity they deserved. The preparation consumed Astrid's days with an intensity that left little room for doubt. She created detailed schedules for feeding, noting which animals needed special attention and where each group preferred to graze. She reinforced every fence that showed weakness, cleared drainage channels to prevent flooding during autumn rains, and stockpiled enough grain to last a month, even though she would be gone less than a week. Halstein visited more frequently as the gathering approached, bringing not just supplies, but also a young man named Torsten, the Jarl's nephew, who would stay at the ranch during Astrid's absence. Torsten was perhaps 16 winters, tall and quiet, with gentle hands that animals seemed to trust instinctively. He spent 3 weeks learning the ranch's rhythms, following Astrid through her daily routines, asking careful questions and listening more than he spoke. Your uncle taught my father about animal husbandry, Torsten told her one evening as they mended a section of fence together. Father always said Erik understood creatures better than most people understand their own families. I see that gift continued in you. Astrid felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment. She was not accustomed to praise, had come to expect only her own harsh judgment of her capabilities. I am learning still. Every day something happens that I do not know how to handle properly. That never stops, Torsten said with a slight smile. My father has worked with animals for 30 years, and he still encounters situations that baffle him. The learning is what makes it worthwhile. The comment settled something in Astrid's chest, a tension she had not known she carried. She had been measuring herself against her uncle's decades of experience, finding herself wanting in the comparison. The idea that uncertainty was permanent, that even masters still learned, made her own ignorance feel less like failure. As the departure date approached, the animals seemed to sense the change coming. Stormwind stayed closer than usual, following Astrid from task to task, with an attention that bordered on excessive. The sheep gathered near the barn each evening, instead of spreading across their usual grazing areas. Even the cattle, normally content to wander at will, kept within sight of the main buildings. They know something is different, Torsten observed. Animals are sensitive to their keeper's emotional state. Your anxiety about leaving is communicating itself to them. Astrid tried to project calm she did not feel, but the animals were not fooled. On her last evening before departure, she walked the entire property as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. She visited each major grouping, speaking softly to animals she had come to know as individuals. Bergthora, the first sheep to trust her, now heavy with lamb. Ironhorn, the bull who patrolled boundaries with tireless dedication. The goats who had shown her the hidden meadow, still smug about their secret. At the cliff pasture she found Stormwind waiting as if the mare had known she would come. Astrid pressed her face against the horse's neck and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability she rarely permitted. I will return, she whispered. 4 days, perhaps 5. Torsten will care for you well, but I will return, I promise. Stormwind's breath was warm against her hair, steady and patient. The mare had survived abandonment and starvation, had learned to trust again, despite every reason not to. If she could do that, surely Astrid could survive a few days among strangers. The morning of departure arrived, with clear skies and a wind that carried the scent of changing seasons. Helstein's boat waited at the shore, larger than the one that had first brought the Jarl's men to investigate. Astrid wore her best dress, carefully cleaned and mended, and carried a small pack with essential belongings. Her father's drinking horn was wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the pack, a piece of her history she could not leave behind. Torsten walked with her to the cliff path, carrying her pack despite her protests. They will be well, he said quietly. I give you my word, as my family gave their word to your uncle years ago. No harm will come to them while they are in my care. I know, and she did know, intellectually, but her heart struggled to accept what her mind understood. She had not been separated from the sanctuary since arriving. It had become not just her responsibility, but her identity. The thing that gave her life purpose after loss had taken everything else. The journey down the cliff path felt like walking away from herself. She did not look back, fearing that if she saw the ranch again she would lose her courage entirely. At the shore, Holstein greeted her with respect that still felt strange, as if she were someone important rather than an orphaned child playing at being a keeper. The boat pulled away from shore, oars cutting through dark water. Astrid finally allowed herself to turn and look back. The ranch spread across the high ground above, buildings small with distance but unmistakable. As she watched, a dark shape appeared at the cliff's edge. Stormwind, watching her leave, standing sentinel until the boat rounded a bend and the ranch disappeared from view. The fjord stretched ahead, water reflecting sky, carrying her toward a gathering of people she did not know and a role she had never imagined claiming. Astrid gripped the boat's rail and forced herself to breathe steadily. She was the keeper of a sanctuary that sheltered 200 lives. She was the inheritor of a legacy built on defiance of cruelty. She was the daughter of people who had chosen kindness over safety. She could do this. She had survived worse. And in 4 days, she would return to the animals who depended on her, carrying whatever knowledge and connection she gained at the Jarl's Hall. The sanctuary would be stronger for her courage. She had to believe that, because the alternative was fear that would drown her if she let it. The boat moved steadily southward, and Astrid watched the landscape slide past, each familiar landmark falling behind, until she traveled through territory she had never seen. The world was larger than her ranch, larger than her loss, larger than she had allowed herself to remember. For a few days, she would be part of that larger world, and then she would return home to the refuge that needed her. The journey had begun. All she could do now was move forward and trust that the path would lead her back. The Jarl's Hall rose from the landscape like a statement carved in timber and stone. It dominated the settlement around it, a structure built to impress and intimidate in equal measure. Carved posts flanked the entrance, decorated with intricate patterns that told stories of battles won and alliances forged. Smoke rose from holes in the roof, carrying the scent of roasting meat and wood smoke. Astrid stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, feeling impossibly small and out of place. Men and women moved with confidence, born of status and wealth, their clothing fine, their bearing assured. She wore her best dress, but it was still the garment of someone who worked with her hands, simple and practical. Her hair was braided neatly, but lacked the elaborate styling she saw on other women. She carried no jewelry except her father's drinking horn, which hung from her belt in its leather case. Holstein appeared at her side, his presence steadying. The Jarl will formally recognize landholders at sunset. Until then, people will gather and talk. You need not speak to anyone if you prefer, but opportunities to learn rarely come without some discomfort. He was right, of course. Astrid had not traveled all this way to stand silent in corners. She forced herself to move into the crowd, listening to conversations, learning names and faces. She discovered quickly that age did not matter as much as she had feared. A boy barely older than herself managed extensive fishing operations. A woman with grey hair spoke of breeding horses with knowledge that commanded respect from men twice her size. What mattered here was competence and the courage to claim one's place. A group of landholders gathered near one of the great pillars, discussing the challenges of the coming winter. Astrid drifted close enough to listen. They spoke of food storage, of protecting livestock from cold, of the constant struggle against predators. She recognized these challenges intimately, had faced them herself. The wolves grow bolder each year, a heavy man with elaborate silver arm rings said. I lost 15 sheep last winter despite employing 3 shepherds to watch them. Guard dogs, suggested another. Properly trained, they can drive wolves off before the pack settles in to hunt. Dogs are expensive to keep and train, and they can turn on the flock if not managed correctly. Astrid spoke before she could stop herself. Wolves hunt where prey is vulnerable and scattered. If animals are kept in coordinated groups with natural defensive formations, losses can be minimized without additional expense. The conversation stopped. All eyes turned to her, and Astrid felt heat crawl up her neck. She had interrupted men of status and experience with the confidence of someone who had the right to speak. But she had spoken, and there was no way to unsay the words. The heavy man studied her with interest rather than offense. You have experience with this approach? I managed 200 animals with no staff except myself. Last winter, a wolf pack attacked during a snowstorm. We lost 2 sheep total because the animals fought together in coordinated defense rather than scattering in panic. 200 animals alone. The skepticism in his voice was clear. What are you, child, some kind of animal whisperer? I'm Astrid Bjornsdottir, keeper of Eric's sanctuary at the northern fjords. I inherited the ranch and its inhabitants 6 months ago. The animals survived because they had learned coordination during my uncle's stewardship. I simply maintained what he built. Recognition dawned on several faces. The name Eric clearly meant something to these people. The heavy man's expression shifted from skepticism to genuine interest. The keeper's heir. We heard rumors of a child managing that legendary operation, but I confess I did not believe it possible. Another landholder, a woman with keen eyes and weathered hands, leaned forward. Tell us about this defensive coordination. How do you train livestock to fight together? Astrid explained, her initial nervousness fading as she spoke of things she knew intimately. She described how cattle naturally form protective circles, how horses can be positioned to drive predators away from smaller animals, how even sheep will mass together and use their numbers as weapon when properly led. She spoke of observation and patience, of learning animal behavior rather than trying to force them into unnatural patterns. The crowd around her grew as others heard fragments of the conversation and moved closer. Questions came from multiple directions. How did she manage feeding schedules? What did she do about injuries? How did she handle birthing season alone? She answered each question with the practical knowledge earned through months of trial and error, success and failure. By the time sunset approached and the Jarl called for formal assembly, Astrid had spoken with a dozen landholders, shared knowledge with people who had decades more experience than her, and received more respect than she had thought possible. Several had offered to visit her ranch in spring, to see her methods firsthand, and perhaps learn techniques they could apply to their own operations. The formal recognition ceremony was brief but significant. The Jarl, a man whose authority was evident in every gesture, called each landholder forward to be acknowledged. When Astrid's turn came, he spoke her name clearly and added words that carried through the hall. Astrid Bjornsdottir, keeper of the Northern Sanctuary, youngest landholder in our territory, and worthy inheritor of her uncle's legacy. Let it be known that her holdings are recognized and protected under our law. The assembled crowd acknowledged with voices and the striking of weapons against shields. It was done. She was not just a child playing at responsibility. She was a recognized landholder, her position secure, her capability proven. That night, sleeping in guest quarters far more comfortable than her barn loft, Astrid allowed herself to feel pride. Not arrogance, but the quiet satisfaction of having faced fear and found herself adequate to the challenge. She had spoken among people of experience and status. She had shared knowledge and received respect. She had claimed her place not through family name or inherited wealth, but through competence earned in daily labor and crisis survived. Tomorrow she would begin the journey home, carrying new knowledge and new connections. But tonight she let herself rest in the understanding that she belonged in this world of landholders and keepers. Her age was a curiosity, but her capability was what mattered. The sanctuary had a guardian who could stand among equals. The animals had chosen well when they accepted her as their keeper. She fell asleep thinking of Stormwind, watching from the cliff, of Berg Thora, heavy with lamb, of 200 lives depending on her return. 4 days had felt like forever when she left. Now, with 2 days remaining before she could go home, every hour felt too long. The sanctuary called to her across the distance, and she longed to answer. The second day at the Jarl's Hall brought unexpected complications. Astrid woke to find Hallstein waiting outside her quarters, his expression troubled in ways that immediately put her on alert. "There is someone who wishes to speak with you," he said carefully. "A man named Ragnar, who claims to have known your uncle. He arrived late last night and learned of your presence here." Something in Hallstein's tone warned her that this meeting would not be pleasant. She followed him through the hall's corridors to a smaller room where a man waited. He was perhaps 40 winters, powerfully built, with scars that spoke of violence survived. His eyes held a hardness that made Astrid's instincts scream caution. Ragnar stood when she entered, but the gesture held no respect. "So you are the girl who inherited Eric's collection. I must say, I expected someone older, someone capable." Astrid kept her voice level despite the insult. "I am Astrid Bjornsdottir, legal heir to my uncle's property. What business do you have with me?" "Business indeed." Ragnar's smile did not reach his eyes. Your uncle acquired several animals that rightfully belonged to me. A black stallion, taken from my lands 8 years ago. 3 breeding mares, disappeared from my pastures 6 years past. I have documentation of ownership, and now that Eric is dead, I have come to reclaim what was stolen. The words struck like physical blows. Astrid thought immediately of Stormwind, the black mare with the white star. But Ragnar had said stallion. She forced herself to think clearly through. Rising panic. My uncle kept detailed records of every animal's origin. If you can prove ownership, I will review his documentation. I need prove nothing to a child. The animals are mine. I will collect them when I travel north next month. You will do no such thing without legal claim verified by the Jarl himself. Astrid's voice came out stronger than she felt. My uncle's property is protected under law. You cannot simply take what you wish. Ragnar took a step closer. His size and presence clearly meant to intimidate. Your uncle was a thief who hid behind noble intentions. He took animals from their rightful owners and pretended he was saving them. I'm one of many he wronged, girl. If you are wise, you will not make the same enemies. Halstein moved to stand beside Astrid, his hand resting on his sword hilt. This conversation is finished. If you have legal claims, present them formally to the Jarl. Otherwise, remove yourself from the lady's presence. Ragnar's expression darkened, but he recognized the threat. He left without another word, but his parting look promised the matter was far from settled. When they were alone, Astrid sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Is he telling truth? Did my uncle steal animals? Your uncle rescued animals from situations of cruelty and neglect. Some of those situations involved men like Ragnar, who see creatures only as property to be used and discarded. Whether that constitutes theft depends on whose version of law one follows. But if he has documentation of ownership, documentation can be created or manipulated. Your uncle's records are meticulous and witnessed. The Jarl will not overturn established ownership without compelling evidence. Halstein paused. But you should know, Ragnar is not the only one who has questioned your uncle's methods over the years. There are those who resent what Eric built, who see the sanctuary as judgment against their own treatment of animals. The news settled like a stone in Astrid's stomach. She had been so focused on wolves and weather, on the immediate challenges of keeping animals alive, that she had not fully considered the human threats her uncle must have faced constantly. Men with wounded pride and financial grievances. People who saw his sanctuary as implicit criticism of their own cruelty. The rest of the day passed in a blur of carefully neutral interactions. Astrid smiled when appropriate, answered questions about her ranch, but her mind kept returning to Ragnar's threat. That evening, she requested a private audience with the Jarl. Jarl Eriksson received her in his personal chamber, a room lined with weapons and maps. He listened without interruption, as Astrid explained the encounter and her concerns. Ragnar is known to me, the Jarl said when she finished. He is a man of limited honor but considerable cunning. He will try to find weaknesses in your uncle's documentation, legal technicalities that might support his claim. However, your uncle served me faithfully in his youth, and his records were always beyond reproach. I will not allow opportunists to dismantle what he built, simply because death has left it in young hands. What if he brings others? What if more people come forward claiming ownership? Then each claim will be examined on its merits. But understand this, child. Your uncle made enemies precisely because he refused to accept that power gave men the right to treat animals with casual cruelty. Some of those enemies have waited years for an opportunity to strike at his legacy. They see you as that opportunity, a target too young and inexperienced to defend what you inherited. Then they have misjudged me. The words came out fiercer than Astrid intended. The Jarl smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. I believe they have, but words and courage will not be enough. You must ensure your uncle's documentation is impeccable, that every animal's origin is recorded and witnessed. You must build alliances with people who value what the sanctuary represents. And you must be prepared for challenges that go beyond wolves and winter. That night, Astrid barely slept. She thought of each animal under her care, wondering which ones might be claimed by men like Ragnar. She thought of Stormwind especially, the mare who had become her closest companion. What would she do if someone arrived with papers claiming ownership? Could she bear to surrender an animal to someone who saw them only as property? By morning, her exhaustion had hardened into determination. She would return to the ranch and spend whatever time was necessary verifying every entry in her uncle's ledger. She would seek out witnesses who remembered animals arriving, who could testify to circumstances if needed. She would build the legal fortress her uncle had started, making the sanctuary unassailable by those who would tear it down. The gathering had taught her that capability earned respect, but it had also shown her that respect was not enough. She needed to be smarter, more prepared, more careful than anyone expected a 12-year-old to be. The sanctuary's enemies were not just wolves in the darkness. Some wore human faces and carried documents instead of teeth. Halstein found her at dawn, preparing for the journey home. "You are troubled," he observed. "I am awake," Astrid replied. "Awake to threats I was too naive to see before. But I will see them now, and I will be ready." The boat waited at the shore. Home called across the distance, and with it work that could not wait. The journey home felt longer than the journey away, though the distance was identical. Astrid stood at the boat's prow, watching the familiar coastline emerge from morning mist. Every rock formation, every curve of the shore was a landmark, bringing her closer to the sanctuary. Her hands gripped the rail with intensity that made her knuckles white. When the ranch finally came into view on the high ground above the fjord, relief flooded through her so powerfully that tears stung her eyes. The building stood intact. Animals grazed in visible groups across the hillsides. No smoke rose except from the house chimney. No signs of disaster or crisis. Everything appeared exactly as she had left it. The climb up the cliff path tested her impatience. She wanted to run, to see with her own eyes that all was truly well, to count each animal and confirm their safety. But the path was steep and required attention. One misplaced step could send her tumbling down rocks to the fjord below. Torsten met her at the top of the path, his expression relieved. "Welcome home, Lady Astrid. All has been quiet in your absence. The animals missed you, I think, but they accepted my care without trouble." Lady Astrid sounded strange and formal after days of hearing herself addressed that way at the Jarl's hall. Here on her ranch, the title felt unnecessary. But she thanked Torsten warmly and asked for his full report as they walked toward the house. He had kept detailed notes, she discovered. Which animals ate well and which seemed off their feed. 2 chickens that had gone missing, likely taken by a fox. A fence section that had broken and been repaired. Bergthora had moved slowly one day, concerning him, but by the next morning she was back to normal. Minor issues, the kind that arose constantly in the work of keeping animals alive and well. "You did excellent work," Astrid told him sincerely. "I am grateful beyond words." Torsten smiled, the expression making him look younger than his 16 years. "It was an honor. Your uncle's methods are remarkable. I learned much that I can bring back to my own family's holdings." He paused. "There was one unusual thing. The black mare with the white star, she stood at the cliff edge every dawn and dusk, watching the fjord as if waiting for something." Astrid's throat tightened. "Stormwind. She was watching for my return. I thought perhaps that was it. Animals know their people in ways we do not fully understand." After Torsten departed with promises to visit again in spring, Astrid walked slowly through the ranch, reacquainting herself with every familiar sight and sound. Animals approached her freely, sheep pressing close enough to touch, goats following in chattering groups. The cattle watched her pass with calm recognition. Even the pigs emerged from their favorite wallowing spot to investigate her return, but Stormwind was nowhere visible. Astrid walked to the cliff pasture where the horses usually grazed. The herd was there, 11 strong, but the black mare stood apart from the others, facing away toward the distant mountains. "Stormwind," Astrid called softly. The mare's ears flicked back, acknowledging the voice. But she did not turn, did not approach. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by wind through grass and the distant cry of gulls. Astrid stood waiting, patient as the animals had taught her to be. Finally, Stormwind turned. She walked toward Astrid slowly, each step deliberate, until they stood face to face. The horse lowered her great head and pressed her forehead against Astrid's chest. Breathing out heavily, as if releasing tension held for days, Astrid wrapped her arms around Stormwind's neck and felt the mare's heartbeat, strong and steady. "I came back," she whispered. "I promised, and I came back." They stood that way for a long time, girl and horse, reconnecting in silence more profound than words. When they finally separated, something had shifted. The bond between them had been tested by absence and proven strong enough to survive. Trust deepened by temporary loss and certain return. That evening, Astrid sat at the kitchen table with her uncle's ledger open before her. She began the work the Jarl had advised, going through every entry with new scrutiny. Each animal's origin was recorded, but some notes were cryptic, written in shorthand only her uncle would have fully understood. Black mare, found starving. Previous owner deceased. No heirs, told her Stormwind's history, but provided no witnesses or documentation that would satisfy a legal challenge. She made lists as she worked. Animals with clear documentation and multiple witnesses. Animals with uncertain origins that might be vulnerable to claims. Animals like Stormwind, whose stories were recorded but not legally airtight. The work was tedious and sometimes heartbreaking, reading about the circumstances that had brought each creature to the sanctuary. Hours passed. The candle burned low and had to be replaced. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch provided familiar comfort. Animals settling into sleep, the wind moving through buildings, the distant rush of the fjord against the cliffs. When she finally closed the ledger, dawn was not far away. She had identified 20 animals whose documentation might be challenged. 20 lives that could potentially be taken if someone like Ragnar pushed hard enough with legal claims. The thought made her feel sick, but she also had a plan now. She would seek out people who had known her uncle, who had witnessed animals arriving at the sanctuary. She would gather sworn statements, build a network of testimonies that would support the ledger's entries. She would make the sanctuary's legal foundation as strong as its physical one. The work ahead was daunting, but she had faced wolves and winter isolation and responsibility beyond her years. She had stood among landholders and earned their respect. She had left her sanctuary and found the courage to return. Each challenge survived had made her stronger, more capable of facing the next. Astrid walked outside into the pre-dawn darkness. She rang the brass bell, and the sound rolled across the property like a promise. Animals stirred in their sleeping places, acknowledging the call. She was home. They were safe, and together they would face whatever threats emerged from the human world with the same coordinated strength that had driven away the wolves. The sanctuary had survived another test, and its keeper had returned from the wider world with knowledge that would help protect it from dangers she was only beginning to understand. The inheritance was more complicated than she had known, but it was hers, and she would defend it with everything she had learned and everything she was still learning. Dawn broke over the fjord, painting the world in shades of gold. Astrid watched the light spread across her land and felt something close to peace. She was exactly where she belonged. Autumn deepened into the kind of cold that warned of harsh winter ahead. Astrid worked with renewed purpose, dividing her time between daily animal care and the painstaking task of strengthening the sanctuary's legal protections. She wrote letters to people her uncle had known, requesting meetings and witness statements. Some responded with warmth and offers of help. Others sent polite refusals or no response at all. Halstein visited regularly, bringing not just supplies, but also news from the wider territory. Ragnar had not yet made formal claim to the Jarl, but word spread that he was gathering documentation and support from others who resented the sanctuary's existence. The threat was real and growing. On a grey morning when frost painted the grass silver, an unexpected visitor arrived. An old woman climbed the cliff path with surprising agility for her age, her cloak whipping in the wind. She carried a walking staff carved with symbols Astrid recognized as markers of a healer's trade. "I am Joran," the woman announced without preamble. "I knew your uncle for 30 years. Holstein told me you were seeking witnesses to verify animal origins. I have come to provide what testimony I can." Astrid welcomed her with gratitude that bordered on desperation. Over hot tea in the kitchen, Joran spoke of animals she had seen arrive at the sanctuary. She remembered Stormwind's arrival specifically, a starving mare found wandering after her owner died in a fishing accident. The man had no family, no heirs, and the horse would have been left to die or taken by whoever claimed her first. Eric had brought her to the sanctuary and nursed her back to health over months of careful feeding and gentle handling. "Your uncle had a gift," Joran said, her weathered hands wrapped around the warm cup. "He saw the spirit in creatures, not just their usefulness. That mare was half wild with grief and hunger when she arrived. He spent hours sitting near her, just being present, letting her learn that humans could mean safety instead of pain." Did others know about her arrival? Could they testify if needed? "I will swear statement before the Jarl if required, as will my husband, who helped your uncle transport several animals over the years. We are not the only ones. Your uncle built a quiet network of people who shared his values, who helped without seeking recognition or reward." Over the following weeks, more witnesses came forward. A fisherman who had seen Eirik rescue 3 sheep abandoned after their owner's farm burned. A trader who had sold grain to the sanctuary for years and could testify to the number of animals being fed. A woman who had given Eirik 6 chickens rather than slaughter them when her own children grew and left home. Each testimony added another layer of protection. Another piece of evidence that the sanctuary's animals had come through legitimate means, saved from situations of neglect or abandonment rather than stolen from rightful owners. Astrid recorded everything carefully, building a collection of sworn statements that would support the ledger's entries. But the work took time away from the ranch itself, and she felt the strain of divided attention. Animals still needed daily care. Fences required maintenance before winter storms arrived. The apple harvest from the hidden meadow demanded picking and storage. She worked from before dawn until after dark, falling into exhausted sleep each night with lists of uncompleted tasks running through her mind. Bergthora delivered her lamb on a night when snow fell thick and fast. Astrid sat with the ewe in the barn, providing warmth and reassurance through the long labor. The lamb emerged wet and fragile, and for terrible minutes Astrid thought it would not survive. But Bergthora's instincts took over, cleaning and nudging, until the small creature found its feet and began to nurse. Watching the lamb's first unsteady steps, seeing Bergthora's fierce protective instincts, Astrid felt something crack open in her chest. This was why the sanctuary mattered, not just because the animals needed safety, but because they deserved the chance to live full lives, to bear young and raise them in peace, to know something beyond survival. She named the lamb Solfrid, after the one killed by wolves months earlier, a remembrance and a hope that this new life would have the safety the first had been denied. Winter settled in with unusual severity. The cold cut deep, and snow piled high enough to make some sections of the ranch impassable. Animals huddled in sheltered areas, relying on the hay and grain Astrid distributed daily. She moved through the work in a haze of exhaustion, her body going through practiced motions while her mind wrestled with legal strategies and fears of what might come. One evening, as she struggled to break ice on a frozen water trough, her strength simply gave out. She sank to her knees in the snow, hammer falling from numb fingers, and allowed herself a moment of complete despair. She was 13 years old now, having passed another birthday unmarked and unnoticed. She was alone on a vast property with responsibilities that would challenge someone twice her age. She was fighting battles on multiple fronts with resources that never felt adequate. Stormwind appeared from the gathering darkness, her black coat nearly invisible against the night. The mare lowered her head and breathed warm air against Astrid's face, patient and present. Around them, other animals emerged from shelter to form a loose circle. Not pressing close, not demanding anything, simply being there. Astrid looked up at them through tears that froze on her cheeks. These creatures who had survived abandonment and cruelty, who had learned to trust again, despite every reason not to, who had accepted her as their keeper when she barely knew how to keep herself. They had not given up. They had not surrendered to despair when life dealt them losses. They had survived, adapted, continued. She could do the same. She had to do the same, because they depended on her strength, even when she felt she had none left to give. Astrid picked up the hammer and returned to breaking ice. Her hands ached. Her body trembled with cold and exhaustion. But she worked until the task was complete, until every animal had access to water, because that was what keepers did. They persisted through difficulty. They protected what was theirs to protect. They did not surrender. That night, sleeping in the barn, wrapped in every blanket she owned, Astrid dreamed of spring. Green grass and warm sun, new lambs playing in safe pastures, a sanctuary so secure that no threat could touch it. The dream sustained her through the dark hours, and when dawn came cold and grey, she rose to face another day of work that never ended. The inheritance had taught her that strength was not the absence of fear or exhaustion. Strength was continuing despite them, finding the will to persist when persistence seemed impossible. Her uncle had done this work alone for 30 years. She had managed barely one. But she would manage another and another after that. As many as it took to secure the sanctuary's future and honor the trust her animals had placed in her. Spring arrived with a softness that felt like forgiveness after the brutal winter. Snow melted. Into rushing streams, grass emerged green and tender, and the air carried warmth that made work less painful and hope more possible. Astrid stood on the hill above the ranch and watched her inheritance transform from survival into something that resembled thriving. The animals had made it through, every single one, plus the new births that had come despite the cold. Lambs dotted the hillsides, their bleating a chorus of life continuing. Calves stayed close to their mothers, testing new legs and discovering the world. Foals ran with abandon, their joy so pure it made Astrid's chest ache with something between happiness and grief. She was 13 now, though she felt decades older than the frightened child who had unlocked the gate 9 months ago. Her body had changed with constant labor, her hands permanently calloused, her shoulders stronger from lifting and carrying. But the deeper changes were invisible. She moved with confidence earned through crisis survived. She made decisions without the paralyzing doubt that had once frozen her in place. She had learned to trust herself because there was no one else to trust. Word of her successful defense against Ragnar's claim had spread throughout the territory. Other landholders began visiting, curious about the young keeper who had stood firm against legal challenge. Some came skeptical and left impressed. Others came to learn and stayed to share knowledge. The sanctuary's reputation shifted from Eric's legendary but slightly eccentric operation to a well-managed holding worthy of respect. Among the visitors was a woman named Signa, perhaps 25 winters, who managed her family's extensive sheep operation. She arrived with practical questions about winter feeding and left with an offer that surprised them both. "I need someone I can trust to take over the operation when my father retires," Sina said on her 3rd visit. "But more than that, I need someone who sees animals as you do, as beings worthy of care rather than just resources to be managed. Would you consider a partnership? Your knowledge, combined with my family's resources, could benefit both our holdings." Astrid was too surprised to answer immediately. Partnership meant sharing decisions, trusting another person with matters she had guarded jealously. But it also meant support, access to resources, knowledge she had not yet acquired. Most importantly, it meant she would not always be alone against whatever challenges arose. "I would need to maintain the sanctuary's independence," Astrid said carefully. "These animals are refugees, not livestock to be sold or used for profit. I understand that. I'm not proposing to change what you have built, only to strengthen it through alliance, Think on it. The offer will remain open. That evening, Astrid sat in her uncle's chair with the ledger open before her. She had added so many entries over the months. Births recorded with careful detail. Deaths marked with sadness, but also acceptance of natural cycles. Injuries treated, illnesses survived, small triumphs and daily struggles documented in her increasingly steady handwriting. The ledger had become more than a record. It was a conversation with her uncle, a way of showing him that his work continued, that the sanctuary he built had found a worthy keeper. She added a note about Sina's offer, writing out her thoughts to clarify them. Partnership meant vulnerability but also strength. Her uncle had worked alone by necessity. She had the option to build something larger. A sound at the door made her look up. Stormwind stood at the threshold, too large to enter but clearly wanting Astrid's attention. This had become a nightly routine. The mare would check on her keeper before settling in for sleep, as if ensuring Astrid was safe before allowing herself to rest. Astrid went to the door and pressed her face against Stormwind's warm neck. "What do you think, old friend? Should I trust this alliance? Would Uncle Eric approve?" The horse's only answer was her steady breathing and patient presence. Some decisions had to be made without guidance, trusting instinct over certainty. Astrid had learned that lesson well over the past months. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Holstein arrived with two young people, a brother and sister perhaps 15 and 16, winters old. They stood nervously before Astrid, clearly uncomfortable with whatever mission brought them here. "These are Bjorn and Freydis," Holstein explained. "Their parents died this winter, and they have nowhere to go. They are willing to work in exchange for shelter and food. I thought perhaps the sanctuary could use extra hands." Astrid looked at them closely. She saw her own grief reflected in their eyes, the lost quality of people whose world had been torn away. She saw also potential, young bodies that could help with heavy labor, company to ease the loneliness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. People who might understand what the sanctuary meant because they too needed refuge. "Can you work hard without complaint?" she asked. "Can you learn to see animals as individuals rather than property? Can you keep this sanctuary's secrets and defend what we protect here?" They both nodded, their expressions serious. Freydis spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. "We have lost everything. If you give us a place here, we will prove worthy of the trust. We know about loss. We know about needing sanctuary ourselves," something settled in Astrid's chest. The sanctuary had always been about providing refuge to the abandoned and unwanted. Why should that apply only to animals? Her uncle had worked alone, but perhaps that was limitation rather than necessity. Perhaps the sanctuary could grow to shelter more than one kind of refugee. "Then welcome," Astrid said. "Welcome to a place where the lost can be found, where what others discard is valued, where work is hard, but purpose is clear. Welcome home." Over the following weeks, Bjorn and Freydis proved themselves capable and dedicated. They learned quickly, adapted to the sanctuary's rhythms, and brought energy that Astrid had not realized she desperately needed. The work, divided among three, was still exhausting but no longer crushing. Laughter returned to the property, and with it, a sense that life contained possibilities beyond mere survival. Astrid accepted Sina's offer of partnership, carefully negotiating terms that protected the sanctuary's core mission while gaining access to resources and knowledge. The alliance brought immediate benefits: better grain at reduced cost, access to a healer skilled in animal medicine, legal consultation when questions arose. Most importantly, it brought the understanding that she did not have to carry every burden alone. Summer arrived with warmth and abundance. The hidden meadows' apple trees bloomed spectacularly. Animals grazed in contentment. The sanctuary thrived in ways Astrid had not dared imagine during the desperate winter months. One evening, as sunset painted the fjord gold, Astrid stood with Bjorn and Freydis, watching the animals settle for the night. 243 now, counting the spring births. Each one safe, each one valued, each one proof that the sanctuary's mission continued and expanded. "Your uncle would be proud," Freydis said softly. Astrid thought of Eirik, who had worked alone for 30 years. She thought of her mother, who had paid a price for choosing kindness. She thought of her father, whose patience and wisdom had shaped her even though he was gone. They lived on in the sanctuary's continued existence, in the choices Astrid made, in the lives she protected. "Yes," she said, "I think he would be."